Hello everyone and welcome back to another Blender tutorial. Today we're going to be learning all about the noise texture and how to make the most out of it in Blender 4.5, as this is a really useful procedural built-in texture that we can use to create some awesome procedural materials and really level up your models. So we'll be breaking down this video into three main sections. First, just a quick overview of all the tools for the noise texture. Then we'll be learning about some practical applications of how you can use it. And then we'll finish off with a quick quiz just to try and put all of that information into your long-term memory so you don't forget. So if you're wanting to follow along in Blender, you certainly can. But you can also just watch this on your phone or computer. If you've not got Blender open, that's also fine too, as I'll be trying to structure this video in a way so you can still learn something even if you're not following along. So to get started here, I'm just going to press Shift and then A, and under Mesh, I'm just going to choose Cube. Then I'm going to left click this little viewport shading option here at the top. That's just going to load up a quick preview so we can see what we're doing. And I'm going to come down to this timeline here, and you can see there's a clock at the top left here of this menu, and this just allows us to change menu. So you could actually change this to the 3D viewport if you wanted to have another 3D viewport here. But we're just going to change this to something different called the shader editor. So I'm just going to left click that, and it's set to this line style by default. If yours is set to that, just go ahead and change it to object. And all that means is that it's going to be editing the object's material. And then we can go ahead and press this plus new button. Then we can go ahead and give it a name if you like, but you can just leave it at material if you want, but you can just leave it at material if you want. And if I zoom in here, you can see I've got base color and a few different options. Now, if your material is appearing as completely black, I'm just going to move my face over here, then we need to come to these settings here. Just change your render engine temporarily from cycles to Eevee. And if I come down to ray tracing, you can go ahead and turn that on. And under fast GI approximation, just go ahead and turn that threshold to 1 and it should fix the issue. I'll just turn my render engine back to cycles for now. And yeah, let's go ahead and break down this noise texture. So to add our noise texture, I'm just going to left click and drag to open up this menu a bit more, and I'll zoom in. I'll just press Shift and then A. So much like how we do in the 3D viewport, to add a node in here, we just need to press Shift and A to open the add menu. And if I come to this texture menu here, you can see we've got a whole bunch of different textures. Now, the most basic type of texture is an image texture, which is just using an image from your computer. But we have all these built-in procedural, mathematically generated textures, which are more used for these kind of procedural materials and things like that, if you're familiar. But don't worry, we'll cover a little bit more of that as we go on in the video. So I'm just going to choose noise texture here. And in order to see what it looks like, I'm just going to go ahead and plug this color output by left clicking and dragging it, and just plug it into the surface. Straight away, you can see it's creating this rainbow effect. And this is what you call as noise. So there's two options here. There's a color option and there's also a FAC option. The FAC option is just a grayscale version of the color option. And underneath that, you're going to see that next we have this thing called dimensions. Now, this can confuse a few people, but it's actually very simple. 1D is just going to make it so it is one value or one color. Value, by the way, is just a term we use to refer to level of grayscale, so any number between 1 and 0 to create a black or white color. And if you change this new W number here, it's just going to scroll through a bunch of randomly generated grayscale colors. And the same applies if I plug the color into the surface, then as I adjust this W number, it's going to start creating some random colors for us. So that's what 1D is. Then we've got 2D here, which as you can see is still creating noise on the top, but is kind of struggling to create any noise in the middle here. And that's because it's set to 2D, which means it's only going to be operating on the X and Y axis. So if you can see this little gizmo here, you can see it highlights how there's an X, Y, and a Z axis. So you can notice that the noise is only really being generated across this X and Y line. And of course, if you rotate your object, then it's not going to necessarily change. And that's because the object is going to move with the object's local axis. I'm not going to dive too deep into this because this might confuse some people, but for some of the more advanced users, you may be aware that if you go into edit mode instead, and then press A to select everything, and then rotate the object, you can see that it's going to change because we're inside of edit mode and we're affecting things locally. So I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that just now, as that's a little bit outside the scope of this video. Next up, we've got 3D, and this is what we started with. So this is just going to make sure that we've got noise generated on all three of the axes, so X, Y, and Z. And finally, we've got 4D. So 4D doesn't necessarily generate any noise on an extra axis, but instead it more allows you to move the noise around using this W parameter. So if I move this, you can see it's going to start randoming up the noise, which is pretty cool if you wanted to make some kind of animation with moving noise. And if you can imagine, you could use this to create some sort of texture which can be moving, which is pretty cool because you can actually animate all of these different parameters here, which is a little bit outside the scope of the video, but essentially how it works is you move to a point in the timeline and then you can just press I by hovering over this, and that just inserts a keyframe at that point. I'll press Ctrl-Z to undo that just now. So that's how it works. And then we have this parameter here called scale. So I'm just going to change back to 3D just now. Scale here just allows you to adjust the size of the texture. So you can see as I decrease it, it's going to make it a little bit bigger. And as I increase it, it's just going to add more and more noise. Then we've got this detail parameter. Now there is a little bit more of a technical explanation, which is that essentially it's multiplying noise textures on top of each other. But to keep it simple, it just kind of creates a more grainy layered on effect, which can be pretty cool if you're using the noise texture to create a height map or something. I'll talk more about the practical applications later, but if you were to create a height map or something like that, you could use this detail parameter to create a little bit more of a grainy effect on that. So one thing to remember about this detail, if I set it back to the default, which I believe is 2, is that when you do increase this, it does increase the amount of performance it's using. Of course, this doesn't apply if you turn your procedural material into an image texture, but when you're using it as a node, when you increase the amount of detail here, it is going to have effect on render times and performance and things like that. So do keep that in mind. But again, a lot of the time people are going to end up turning your procedural materials into image textures if you're going to use them for performance worthy things like games and things like that. So you don't need to worry too much about this, but that's just something to keep in mind. Then if I left click and drag this to make this a bit bigger, you can see that we have this roughness parameter. So if I turn this to 1, this is just going to make it so the detail parameter is in full effect. So think of this as a extra controller for the detail parameter. If I turn this roughness to 0 here, you can see that there's no detail at all, and it would be the same as if I was to set the detail to 0, and you can see if I put this roughness back to 1, it's still the same, because the roughness essentially is like an on and off switch for the detail. So I'm going to set the detail back to 2, and I'll set the roughness back to 0.5, which is the default. And then we have a couple of other parameters which you can play around with as well. There's lacunarity, which just creates a little bit of a unique effect. This can be really cool for creating some different procedural materials. And if I go ahead and undo that change. Also, if you forget what the default value for anything is, you can just right click here and then just choose reset to default value. And that very easily does that. And you can also use the backspace button to do that too. Then distortion, all that's going to do is going to make things look a little bit more psychedelic here. So that's pretty cool. And can't really think of too many applications for this. Maybe quite an oily effect potentially. But I haven't used this too much personally, but it's still a really cool effect. Could definitely be using it for some more kind of creative materials here. So overall, there's a lot of stuff. Now, if I come over to this distortion, we'll use that hotkey which we talked about, which remember, if you press backspace, it's going to reset to the default. And let's go ahead and talk about this one thing which I've been skipping here, which is this whole FBM section and normalize. First of all, the normalize, if I turn this off, you can see it's gone ahead and gotten rid of a lot of the white values. And if I plug the factor back in, you can see that this is looking a little bit like the old school Musgrave texture. So that's essentially what the normalize function has become, is turned more into this kind of Musgrave function. And you will notice, I think it is still a little bit different. So there is a one we can use, which is a little bit more like the Musgrave texture, if you remember that. This is for more old school Blender users from Blender version, I think it was 4.1 that the Musgrave texture got removed. Can't quite remember. But yeah, if I go to FBM here and change this to hetero terrain, you can see we've got a little bit more of an old school Musgrave texture here as well. So if you ever need that, it's just been combined with a noise texture now. And that was just to try and simplify the Blender workspace, I believe. So yeah, there's a few of these different options which you can go ahead and experiment with to get a few different options. So we've got multifractal here, we've got rigid, multifractal, see what that looks like. Oh yeah, this looks quite unique. So I think I've used this once before to create a kind of procedural wallpaper material. So there's a few different things you can use here. And what's this hybrid multifractal? Oh yeah, okay. That's pretty much just like a Musgrave texture as well. So yeah, a few different options. And I'll turn this normalize back on just to get the default noise texture. And that's essentially how it works. One last thing that I want to explain before we go ahead and talk about the practical applications, we're kind of getting into that section there, is if I press Shift and then A, then under input, I go ahead and choose texture coordinates. I don't need to worry too much about this thing. I know this is we're getting into more nodes here and it can be a little bit confusing for some people. But essentially the only ones that I want you guys to worry about right now are these UV and object. So if you guys know what UV unwrapping is, all this is going to do is it's going to make it so the noise texture, when I plug it into vector, is going to use the object's UV, which you can make through UV unwrapping. Now, most of you don't even want to think about UV unwrapping because it's such a menace of a thing to learn for a lot of people. So we'll leave UV just now and we'll go for something which is a little bit simpler and what I use a lot of time for creating these precision materials, and that's we use this object input here. So that loads up. Essentially all this object thing does is it distributes the texture across the object evenly. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if it doesn't look like it's distributing evenly, like for example, let's say it looks, will this work if I do this? Yes. So if I press S and then Z, you can see that is kind of created this effect, and it's not evenly distributed now. It's kind of stretched, which you may want, but a lot of the time you might just be getting this by accident and you want to try and fix it. So to fix it, all you need to do is press Control and then A. This is going to open something called the Apply menu, and this allows you to apply transforms, which essentially resets it so everything will be distributed evenly. So I'll go ahead and choose Scale, and you can see now everything is in working order. So that's just something to keep in mind whenever you scale things in object mode. This doesn't apply to edit mode. In object mode, when you scale things up, it's sometimes going to do this. And to fix that, all you need to do is press Control and then A, and then choose the scale. I've got a whole video on applying the scale if you're not familiar with the concept, but that's essentially how it works. So yeah, so that's the texture coordinate. And next up, we're going to go ahead and plug this into this thing here, which I haven't actually deleted. And this here is a shader. And you can see it's a shader because it has this green bar at the top, and that's how you know. And it says BSDF, which just means bidirectional scattering distributing function, I believe. And that just refers to essentially what it's doing and how it's calculating the shading. So what a shader is essentially, if I go ahead and plug these in between, is now reacting to lighting. Now, the lighting which is reacting to here is not some kind of light object, which I've added in my scene. It's using this material preview here. And what the material preview has is like a basic world lighting, which is applying to all the objects. So if you're confused as to why your light objects aren't affecting in this mode, that's why. It just uses a completely different lighting system, but it is still affected by lighting. So that's why you can see a difference when you use the shader here. But of course, if you wanted to see your own lighting system, you need to go into this render preview, but I don't have any lights in my scene, so we won't go ahead and cover that today. And when you plug it into the base color here, it's now, instead of just a flat texture like it was before, which was just lighted up evenly everywhere, it's now got a little bit of shading, which means when we move it around in a lit up space inside of 3D, then it's going to be shaded properly. So this is where you could start practically applying this. For example, if you wanted to create a wood texture, which is something I like to create a lot, we can use an extra node here called the mapping node. So I know we're going to be talking about another node here, but I promise this isn't too complicated, and we'll be using this node a lot when we're talking about these textures. So I'll go to vector, and then we're going to choose mapping, and we're just going to go ahead and plug that in between there. And what you can do if you want to go ahead and create a basic wood texture is you can change the scale here to something bigger, like, I don't know, let's put it to 5. And then we can go ahead and change the scale on the texture and make it something a bit smaller. So maybe 4 is a good number. And you can see we've kind of got a bit of a wood grain effect. Now the issue is it's only doing it on that one axis. So how can we get it so it's working on the side too, to kind of create a bit of a Minecraft log effect? So to do that, we can just go ahead and edit the X as well. Just change that to 5. And there we go. Now we've got a kind of grain effect there. Now you might be thinking, how can I get the top bit to be grainy? And we would just need to apply like a duplication of the procedural material or something like that. Because if I go ahead and change the Z to 5 as well, it's now even again. So it's not going to have a kind of contrast like it has just now. So press Ctrl Z to undo that. And I apologize if that's a little bit confusing. I know these kind of axes things are a little bit confusing, but I just want you to think about what exactly it means here. So here it says mapping, and this is scale. So it's scaling the texture and is scaling it on these axes, which I've defined here. So you can see I'm scaling it on the X axis by 5, which is squashing it in by 5, right? And it's the same with the Y as well. So I'm not going to go too deep into it because I want you to try and think through it and try and understand it, because memorizing it isn't really going to help here. This is something you've got to try and understand. And the easiest way to do that is to go ahead and just practice and play around with the tools. That's how I've done it personally. But you can just try and think of it if you just want a more kind of mental kind of model of thinking of it. Just think of it as how you're kind of scaling it or pushing it together. So that's essentially how that works. And then we could go ahead and add some basic color here by, if I just press Shift and then A, and then I can go into, I think converter is probably a good option here. And we choose the color ramp, which everyone's favorite node. And I'll plug it in here. This isn't the only node you can use to do this, but this is one of the most commonly used ones. And here you can see we've got 2 little wedge things here. So if I click this, you can see it's got a black color under here. And if I left click this one, you can see that it's got a white color under here. If you're struggling to click it, just try double clicking it. That should work. There we go. And we'll go ahead and change this to a more kind of brown color. So I'll increase the brightness, and I'm just going to go for this kind of orangey red color. And then I'm going to turn the brightness right down on this one. It's going to be the kind of darker area. And then we got this lighter color. So we'll just choose a lighter brown here. And we'll again turn the brightness quite down. Maybe we can make this a little bit brighter like this. This is kind of something you just got to play around with a little bit. All right. And so now you can see we're kind of creating a bit more of a wood texture. Probably need to spend a little bit more time on it to make it look pretty good, but this is just a basic rundown of how we can start to use this noise texture. And this isn't the only practical application. It's got much more to it than just a wood texture. People use this all the time to create imperfection maps and things like that. For example, if I go ahead and reset this to 1, all right, we've got our basic noise texture again, and we'll get rid of this just now. And let's say I want to have it so let's maybe make a nice red base color so we can see it. And what if I want to have like fingerprint marks or just imperfection marks like that on the smoothness of the object? So if you're familiar with shaders at all, you'll be aware that roughness is something that we can adjust to control the reflectivity of the object. Or to be more precise, it's not really reflectivity we're editing, it's more reflection clarity. So how clear can we see reflections in something, because everything has reflection, it's just varying degrees. Anyway, don't worry too much about a technical explanation. If I was to go ahead and plug this factor, so the grayscale value, into the roughness, you can see how now different parts are much rougher and different parts are much more kind of reflective here. So you can see we've got varying degrees of reflection, and you can just adjust this by changing the scale. A lot of people love to use the Musgrave texture for this, which is what I used to use a lot. So I'll change this to hetero terrain, and you can see we've got quite a bit of contrast there. Or you can also go to FBM again, and you can just turn off normalize. So you can see there's quite a few different options. And if you wanted to adjust this further, you could use a color ramp again. So I could press Shift A, search for the color ramp, and we're going to use the color ramp in a different way this time. So if I plug this in here, and if I left click and drag one of these notches, you can see I can increase the sharpness, and I can also increase where I want things to appear to. So I can bring the white one closer to make it a little bit bigger. Just try hybrid and multifractal here. And if you're not really sure what exactly this is doing, then all you need to do is plug the color into the surface so you can actually see. And you can see this is what it's doing. Now, these black areas are going to be the more reflective areas, and the areas that are closer to white are going to be the more rougher or less reflective areas. So that's essentially how these textures work when plugged into the roughness parameter. All right. And one last thing I'm going to show you before we go ahead and move on to our quiz here is how we can use this to make things bumpy as well. And this would be making it bumpy without doing any actual modeling, which is pretty cool. So here we can just go to vector, and if we just choose bump, then this node here is going to allow us to create a bumpy effect. So if I plug this normal into the normal of the shader, right now nothing is going to happen because we don't have anything plugged in. But if I go ahead and take this color of my color ramp, my noise texture, and plug it into the height, and if I unplug the roughness as well, just so we can't really see it, you can see, especially as I start to make this really high contrast, how we've got these kind of bumpy effects coming through. And the more higher contrast you make this, the more obvious it's going to be. And that's a really cool way. And you can see that these are shaded as well. So that means these are almost like 3D effects that you're getting without having to do any modeling. So this is another practical application. And I know this seems like, what the heck would I use this for? But if we go back to our wood example, right? And let's say I wanted to come back to here, and let's change our X to 5 and our Y to 5 as well. And we'll go back to the default, which is FBM, and we'll turn on our normalize. If I go ahead and reset this color ramp, so to do that, I just press that arrow and then choose reset color ramp. When I zoom in here, you can see we've got these kind of grains coming in. And of course, we can adjust that with the scale. And it's a little bit hard to see, so I'll go ahead and adjust the roughness just to make it a bit more obvious. So if I turn down the roughness, you can really start to see these grains coming through. This is probably a different roughness that we would use for wood, but just to show you the grains here a little bit more clearly, you can see they're coming through there. And that's not done with any modeling or sculpting or anything. This is just a nice, easy way to just add some detail using these built-in textures. So those are just some of the applications of the noise texture. It's usually used a lot for the kind of roughness option, which I was showing you earlier, to create some imperfections, but it can also be used with this bump node and for the color node as well if you wanted to create a procedural wood texture. I did make a couple tutorials on creating, I think, an old wood material and also a normal wood material as well. So got a few of those, and if you like, I do in the description below, I've got some free assets like free procedural materials and things like that you can download. I've got some premium ones as well, but there's a free wood one, which you can download, and it can help you get a bit more of a visual understanding of how this is all working. But yeah, that pretty much covers that. Let's go ahead and have a quick quiz now to recap. So first of all, I want you to try and remember, what does the 4D parameter here in this dimensions do? So that's question number 1. So feel free to pause the video and go ahead and answer that in your head or just write it down. So if you guessed that it was all 3 dimensions of the noise texture, but it also allows you to adjust the material with an extra parameter to create a moving effect, then you'd be correct. And of course, you can use this to animate some kind of moving texture or something like that. So there's a few practical applications there. Next up, I want you to think about what the basic difference is between this UV and this object texture coordinate. This is quite a challenging question, but feel free to give it a try and pause the video and I'll answer it in a second. All right, so the UV will use the UV or the UV map coordinates of the object in order to decide where the texture is placed. If you've not done UV unwrapping before, it's essentially converting the 3D object into a 2D form to apply a 2D texture on it. And then the object coordinates, which is the main one that we're focusing on today, is going to allow you to distribute the 3D noise texture across our material evenly. And this, of course, will work with the 4D as well. All right, last question. So if I go ahead and plug this color into the roughness here, and I'll change this to 1, and this to 1, just so we can see it nice and clear. You can see we've got a little bit of variation between what areas are more reflective and less reflective. We can see it more clearly if we just increase the contrast. So yeah, so you can see here now we've got some areas which are really reflective and some areas which are more rough. So how can we tell which areas are going to be more reflective and less reflective based on the color of our noise factor here? So when you try and think about it, remember how we figured it out. So the answer is, if I go ahead and plug the color into the surface, these black or darker areas are going to be the more reflective areas. So the reason for this is because, which I didn't explain earlier, but just to give you a more in-depth explanation, black is represented by the number 0. And if I unplug this roughness here quickly, you can see that the roughness is controlled by a number between 0 and 1. So when we plug a black color into the roughness, it's going to essentially say, okay, make the roughness 0. And when we plug a white color, which is represented with the number 1 into the roughness, it's going to be like, okay, put the roughness to 1. And of course, when we then take a texture which has a lot of varying colors throughout it, then in the parts which are black, it's going to create a much lower roughness. And in the parts that are white, it's going to create a much higher roughness. And the higher roughness are the less clear reflections, and the lower roughness are the very clear reflections. Now, the reason why I say high reflections or low reflections and not no reflections is because there's no such thing as no reflections when it comes to roughness. Roughness is just controlling the reflection clarity or reflection intensity, if you like. Because in the real world, you can't just turn off reflection. Even the most hardest surface like a brick, it still has reflection on it, even though you can't see your reflection or anything like that. It's still reflecting things. It's just because it's so rough, it's not able to reflect materials in the same way that a mirror can, for example. So that's it. That's the quiz complete, and I hope you found that useful, and feel free to let me know what videos you would like to see in the future, and I'll go ahead and catch you in the next video. Take care.